Are you ready to master Angular? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day intense workshop class for individuals or teams. They cover Angular 4 and 2 and focus on the skills and knowledge you need for complex, data-rich applications. They also still offer AngularJS for teams supporting older projects. Bring them to your site or send developers to them in St. Louis, San Francisco, New York, DC, and other cities, and online at angularbootcamp.com. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Angular. This week on our panel we have Ward Bell, Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
Hey everybody. Sorry.
I was like, oh no, I'm not hearing them. They're like invisible guys.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Ward who?
Yeah.
Can we try that again?
Sure.
Oh no, I want this to be the final cut. It's hilarious.
Oh, we should. Yeah, we should just leave it. We also have Alyssa Nicoll.
Hey guys.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a couple of special guests. We have Matt Hippely.
Hi there.
And I started with you because I know I can say your name. And we also have, should I even try, or do you want to say your name for us?
I want to hear you say it, Chuck. I want to hear you do it. Butcher it.
Eudes Petonnet-Vincent.
Yeah, pretty close. It's Eudes Petonnet-Vincent. Impossible
okay.
to pronounce for English-speaking people. Don't worry about it.
And my French grandmother just rolled over in her grave. But it's all good.
Can we do this entire interview in a bad French accent?
Very bad French accent.
That's my Pepe Le Pew.
Oh, our poor guests, they know what they're in for now.
Oh, I'm sure he gets it all the time.
All the time.
Oh, no, I do it to my manager. He loves it.
I'm sorry, but I do not understand what you are saying.
Sacre bleu.
All right, so do you gentlemen want to introduce yourselves before we get too far out there?
Sure, go ahead, Matt, if you want.
Okay, my name is Matt Hippely. I'm a user interface engineer, and I've been working on the Clarity project for over a year now. And my background is in the front end space, but I've spent time on all parts of the stack. As the time has gone on, I've gravitated to the front end because that's something I really enjoy. And one of the things I like about working on Clarity is that it's very challenging to look at the front-end space from a component library point of view. Very different from a lot of the work I've done in the past.
So hi, my name is Eudes again. I am also these days a UI engineer, web UI. I have been working in backend and I mean, just like Matt, all pieces of the stack. I do like UI because it's pretty much the far west still. Anything goes. It's always moving. There's always something to discover. And the reason I was part of the people who started Clarity, and the reason I went in that is because I've always been attracted to writing reusable code or code for engineers as opposed to just writing the apps. So I did the same when I was doing Java. I like writing the tools and the lower level layers rather than the whole app. So component library is perfect for me.
Very cool. Now, do you want to just explain briefly what Clarity is?
Absolutely. We might have wanted to start with that actually because we mentioned it several times. So Clarity is not so. Regarding this show, Clarity is a component library. It's an Angular component library. My bad. But more generally speaking, Clarity is actually a full design system, just like material design is a full design system. And the thing is, we've from the beginning wanted to have both engineers and designers work together. So the design system and the component library are integrated, and there is back and forth constantly between developers coding the components and the designers coming up with the user experience they want. And this is what Clarity has been from the beginning. more specifically, we have a set of UX guidelines and whole design principles for designers. Then we have this Bootstrap-like layer where you can just include the CSS, and a lot of the styles will work for anything static. And finally, we have the full-blown Angular component library that comes on top of that whole stack and lets you get the styles and the logic for more complex components.
So how did this come about? Was Bootstrap or Material just not good enough?
Matt, I'll take that one again, if you don't mind. Yeah, so Bootstrap, I've used Bootstrap a lot before doing Clarity. My main problem is that when you work for a company like VMware or any other large company, they want to customize Bootstrap so much that you end up fighting Bootstrap and rewriting most of the CSS to accommodate your needs. So Bootstrap is fantastic to get started on a project, but once you have a full-blown product that have product managers and designers giving you precise specs, it's too hard to fight against Bootstrap. But at the same time, I want to just
go ahead and give a +1 to that. I have a talk called "Giving Bootstrap the Boot," and I actually gave it at NGConf last year, and it's literally about my experience trying to override Bootstrap for custom things. So I'm 100% behind you, and I feel your pain, man. So yeah, keep going.
But so that also meant we didn't want to become a Bootstrap. But at the same time, VMware has dozens of products, all written as HTML web applications, and they needed a way to unify the UX and the styles across all those products, because up until now, it has been, I hope I won't get fired by saying this, but it has been a mess. Every product has its own designers, its own UX point of view, everything was different. What will happen if you right-clicked in some place in the app would change based on the app. It was very complicated. So they wanted to unify this, and they've had for a while some libraries and some tentative unification with different, shared CSS styles and things like that. But by creating Clarity, VMware finally put a whole full-time team on the issue, and suddenly by doing that, it got very, very fast, almost instantly adopted across the whole company, and we'll still have the whole team maintaining the project. So whenever a product has an issue with, say, the data grid, they don't have to devote dev time to it. They just ask the Clarity team, and the Clarity team works on it. So that has been a huge success for VMware. Now their UIs are consistent, their user experience is consistent across the products, and we're reducing the workload for all products by sharing a lot of the code.
Gotcha. Now, what made VMware want to open source it?
Matt, you came right before open source, remember correctly?
Right. That was my first on-site meeting.
So I'll let you answer this one.
Well, I think one of the draws that brought me to the team was the fact that it was a desire to give back to the outside community. It wasn't going to just be isolated to an internal project. And so when I came on, within the first 2 weeks, we went through the open sourcing process. And I think we've seen quite a few benefits to doing that, in that there are a lot of use cases internal that we've addressed, but then we'll get issues and feedback on our GitHub pages about things that we hadn't had to consider because we were only looking at it from an internal point of view. So I think having the open source, one of the big benefits of having the open source is that we have more eyes on what each component's doing, what it's being used for, how it's being used, and that's a big win, I think, for internal uses as well, because we can address on both sides of the table. That does come with some challenges, but I think that's the big thing for me that is is a good part of the open source initiative.
That was something I wanted to ask you. So you were there right before they open sourced?
Right.
Because I've got a friend who I work with on some software, and we've talked about open sourcing. Joe, winky winky. But one of our concerns was that we'd be inundated with, I guess, PRs or issues or tickets that would take so much time to go through that there would be never any time to actually develop. Have you experienced that since like the open source, or has it not been like that?
Just a little bit, right, Eudes?
Yeah, just a little bit. So the surprising part is, if you asked us initially, one of the main points of open sourcing was, hey, we'll get external PRs and we'll get more people helping. That's not the case. People raise issues. People don't actually post PRs.
Really?
Of course,
I would've thought it
you'll
would've been
get some.
formed
You'll
by
get
both.
some. But there's two parts. First, for every 100 issue you'll get, you'll have 5 PRs trying to solve one of these issues. That's about the ratio we've seen. And the other part is the PRs that come in. The more the stricter you are with your code base, the longer it'll take, and the more you risk alienating people. And this is one part where we're trying to improve. We're extremely strict about our code base. We've got extensive, for instance, test coverage and things like that. And the number of PRs that actually got in after being submitted is pretty low. So we're trying to figure this out. But so far, yeah, PR is not the greatest thing. I just wanted to add one thing to Matt's reasons. Open sourcing for the feedback was a great argument for open sourcing. The other one, when there are two other ones, the second one was we wrote it to be reusable not only for current VMware projects, but also future ones. And as such, it was completely abstract and reusable. So we figured we might as well give it back to the community because it was ready. There was no real point in just keeping it internal. We wouldn't make money off of Clarity, so we might as well release it and contribute to the community because we're using Angular and we're using other open source projects. And the last one, and that one is actually very interesting, but it's very specific to VMware. VMware does software, right? And when you buy VMware software, you install it on hardware that might be HP, Dell, Fujitsu, whatever the hardware provider is. And those hardware providers want to integrate with our products seamlessly. You have something that, say you have a whole data center with Dell servers, and they have this very specific piece of software that they have on every one of the servers that can give you, I don't know, something like the core temperature of the server or the history of the core temperature or something like this. And they want to display this in the VMware products that let you monitor your data center. And by open sourcing Clarity, every single one of those hardware constructors can just write the piece of software with Clarity. And when it gets inserted inside a VMware product, it literally looks like a VMware product. It's perfectly integrated. And that was a huge selling point. And every single one of the partners of VMware loved it.
That makes sense. So what goes into building a component library for Angular? Because, you know, at first blush, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'll just write some components. And I'll put some styles in it even. Woohoo, you know. But it seems like, you know, the consistency in the design and collaboration and everything else, you know, all of a sudden it gets complicated like any other software project.
Yeah, that's a good question. I want to let Matt answer it. And then add stuff to it, maybe.
That's a good approach. That's pretty much how my PRs go, right? No, but one of the things that was refreshing when I joined the team is coming from a more of an agency startup background. I very rarely got to work hand in hand with a designer on a small focused problem. And one of the first components or two that I started making changes to, addressing issues, or trying to write, I went through the process of reading through the spec, which had been already vetted through a design process. So one of the first things that I noticed was that Clarity had implemented a very thorough design process where they looked at the problem. Maybe it's signpost, maybe it's a new feature for the data grid, but they took that in isolation, went through several iterations of design and mocking up and research, and then derived the spec from that. So by the time I got involved in my first component, that work had already been done, and I still had some questions, but a lot of the typical, well, what about this use case, or what about if that use case that come up when you're implementing something, many of those questions were removed, and that was very good. Then as I went through the implementation process, what was cool was, we're all on Slack. So I reached out to the designer with questions, and we had a back and forth. I would push up prototypes of the component or works in progress and get much faster feedback than I was used to from a person who was focused on design. Having worked in the front end, you get a taste for it, but it's not something that I would say I'm especially trained in or good. I think I can do okay, but having somebody who really focused on just the design thought behind the component was very nice. So that's the first two phases I experienced. And then as I, worked with the team more and more, we went through the implementation phase and then submitted the pull request, which again, then was under scrutiny from all the team members, and, had to work to incorporate the feedback to get my pull request for the new component or bug fix or feature into the next release. So that's the process I experienced coming on board, not having been internal to the company before this. It was, they had a very strong design process, and then we had a very close working relationship between the engineer and the designer when we were implementing and creating the new component. And then the team has a very vocal, and as Eudes hinted to earlier, a rigorous review of the code, because one of the things I've come to appreciate about that process, that part of the process, is that code that I think is okay, having that many eyes and that much of a rigorous process on it means things that I hadn't thought of are caught before it gets pushed out to the general release for the next iteration. So that's my experience with our design, implementation, and review process.
On my side, I want to answer this question as, if I want to write a component library, what should I look at first? Not specifically Clarity, but what we discovered and what I believe when writing a component library is that the first thing you have to write is not the code. Sometimes you'll have people doing test-driven development, and I'll say, yeah, obviously you write the test first. No, you don't write the test first. You don't even write the architecture first. You write the API of the component. You write the way you want developers to use your component. And this is critical to me. When you write a component library, you don't have just the end user using your component. You actually have consumers who are developers who take your component, integrate it in their app, and then the end user has access to it. So sure, the end user has to be happy. The design has to be flawless. The user experience has to be good. But you have a developer experience to consider too. And I'd much rather have one less feature and an API that I can learn in 2 minutes than one more feature and having to spend 15 minutes browsing a complex documentation. So writing an API that's as natural and as simple to understand as possible is critical. And turns out, especially with Angular, because Angular is so opinionated, after you wrote the API, most of the architecture and code is decided. From there, you just write it down. But that's what we noticed. And so this is where we're trying to iron out our external contribution process, coming back to Clarity, is we want people to write the API of the feature they want to integrate, of the feature they want to add. Write the API of the new component they're writing. And based on that API, we can discuss it, we can change it, and then they can start thinking architecture and code and tests. But that's the very first step, and that's what I recommend everyone do whenever they write reusable components.
Yeah, I really think that's key. I actually like that idea for any piece of software.
Yeah, no kidding.
But it's hard to do because when it starts out all excited about all the architectures and all the features you can throw at it, and kind of work, you work out, and then you say, well, see, you got to have this API, and it's kind of like, wow, you lost sight of the person who has to consume it. So I really like your perspective there. Another one that I heard that kind of goes along with that is somebody suggested that you should write the press release before you and I really like that idea, and because it says, this is why I think that extra bell or whistle really makes a difference. This is how it's going to make and if you don't have a press release that really makes somebody go, wow, then maybe you shouldn't do the feature. So I like both of those things together.
Yeah, a friend of mine calls that README-driven development, where you write out what it's supposed to do and then you go build it.
Yeah, I think Clarity changed perspective a few too many times for that to work, but I like the idea too.
So I'm a little curious. You evidently you no doubt have heard of Angular material. So Clarity set out what to be and what appears to be the same space as Google's own UX language, which is material, and then there's Angular material laid on it. So did you look at that, or did you feel like you needed your own take on it? What's the relationship, if any?
We definitely looked at it. We didn't look just at material, by the way. There was Lightning from Salesforce. There's a few design systems, and we looked at several of them. The main problem with material that we faced, and this is something that we heard a lot last year at ngConf, is that material is designed and written with mobile development as the first citizen. It's mobile first, then desktops. And as such, on desktop apps, it's very spaced out. You have buttons are huge, paddings everywhere are quite large, etc. And we had people coming to us at ngConf, and every one of them saying, I really like material, but I spend most of my time, just like we said, fighting Bootstrap. This is fighting material, reducing paddings, reducing margins, reducing everything to make it smaller and more and denser and more compact, because what I'm writing is not Twitter on a mobile phone. It's a monitoring application for a desktop. And the thing is, VMware specializes in that. Sure, we like mobile development and we want, the products to work on mobile. But the very first class citizen is desktop.
That's such an important, wow, that is really an important insight. Because, I live mostly in the desktop world also, because I have enterprise clients, and many of the applications we build together are oriented toward people who are familiar with the application. They're not first-time casual users. They're not just sort of floating by and saying, I think I'll check in on how customers' orders and products are doing today. And it's hard to imagine them being able to accomplish a lot in mobile. They can check in on things, dashboards, stuff like that. But the primary experience is for a user who is not trying to change the page, who's trying to see as much information as possible on the page, knows where to expect everything to be, knows what doesn't want the page to move, and wants to click, where to click and all that stuff. They're experienced users trying to get something done, and it imposes a very different design philosophy. Yeah. And that's what I hear you saying. And I know people think you can do both with the same design language, and I'm not sure you can. And you're really raising the question.
So once again, one thing I hope that doesn't get me fired. My answer to the people that were coming to us and say, should I use Material or Clarity or Angular or Clarity at ngConf last year, my answer every time was, are you trying to write what you called, for instance, an enterprise app with data tables and trees and charts everywhere and things like that? If so, then I'd recommend Clarity. If what you're writing is browsing articles or something like this, then definitely go Material, because Clarity is going to be a bit, stacked together or potentially heavy for what you need to do. So when you say we're in the same space, that's the whole point. We don't think we're in the same space because we're not targeting the same type of applications.
Right. Maybe the better word is high information density.
High density, yeah. We do call them enterprise apps too internally. That's how we.
That's kind of got a stink to it, even though that's my life.
I love that word. No, I don't like that word.
It's pretty much enterprise. Pretty much is a turnoff for some people, or ahead. Of course, for other people, and it's not a great divide. But I think information density on a page is something that people recognize as there are different. There are different needs there. So maybe that's the way to go.
Yeah, and
but I get it. That's helpful.
And just to pile on here, I mean, I probably do about half of my browsing on my phone. Just casual browsing.
Wow.
But if
that's a lot of browsing.
But if
easily.
But if I want to go look something up, I have a lot of options on my desktop for tweaking things to make it work. On my phone, I just don't have as many tools. And so for me, the UI is much more critical on my phone. But at the same time, if I'm doing real work, I am on the desktop. And so if you can make that UI just get out of my way, then it saves me much more time than the UI on my phone, if that makes sense.
Haven't you heard we'll only build apps for phones anymore?
I quit.
Please don't say that.
That's all people use anymore is their phones. I do all my coding on my phone. Everything's on my phone.
Wait, okay, was that sarcasm?
I'm scared.
Square.
I want to see somebody coding on their phone. Really?
I have tried to code on my phone and it didn't work. So if you figured it out, I want to know.
Oh, Alyssa, when you are finally ready to be a professional programmer, you will learn to write all of your code in an email.
It's fairly simple.
Oh
you just use dictation, and that's it.
Exactly.
Oh my God, you dictate your code. Now that would be hilarious. Like a talk on how to dictate your code. Oh my God.
Yeah, you just fire up your Amazon Echo.
And I let Siri do all the English for me, so they won't get the words wrong.
I have a question regarding an earlier thing that you mentioned about how, like Bootstrap and other frameworks, you wrestle with them too much, and how you didn't want to build another Bootstrap. Do you have anything to say more on that subject of how you haven't built another Bootstrap, or how you've tried to maybe move the framework away from that?
So we're trying to be as flexible as possible. One of the big tasks we have these days, and we're still working on it, is this is technical, but to flatten our CSS as much as possible so that any customizations can be done with a simple override. One of the issues we had is people were asking for stuff and we were saying, sure, but that's an easy customization on your side. We'd rather not add one extra option on our side if it's 2 lines of CSS on your side. So we're giving those 2 lines of CSS to people. And sometimes those 2 lines had a selector that was a bit too complex, and this is where we're trying to make it as easy as possible. So we're trying to make customizing as easy as possible. Lately, we've been using REMs everywhere, so that if you don't like the baseline that defines our vertical rhythm, you can just override the HTML font size itself, and that recalibrates the whole app. Every single style in our design, every single style in our CSS depends on that main font size. So we're really working towards making it customizable, but at the same time, like Matt mentioned, we have heavy research and decision making on the design side from our designers. So what we also want, and this is where we're still kind of bootstrapped by enforcing stuff, but what we're trying to say is when we're enforcing something, please trust us that it has been researched and it's for a real reason. Something as simple as buttons on the left or on the right of a model, right? I know Material has this distinction to where do you put the buttons. And you might want to put, some users might come to you and say, I want to customize it. Your buttons are on the right of the model. I want them on the left. The answer is going to be no, because the user experience would be worse. And this is where sometimes we're still enforcing things, actually more than sometimes. We're very often enforcing things. But instead of you hesitating or fighting against it to customize it, what we're trying to do is convince you by exposing the arguments of why we did it that way. And if you go look at our documentation, for instance, we're trying to have on all pages design explanations of why we do certain things that way. Why is the pagination on the right? Why is this bordered, or why does this have an extra background color? And this is all explained. One thing also where we really cannot be flexible is accessibility. We have, let's say, higher than average accessibility requirements from VMware. We cannot escape those. We have to respect them. And because of this, we had someone on the team study intensively contrast and legibility of text over different colors. And it turns out we checked on Material, we checked on Bootstrap, we checked on all of these. They do not pass the highest standards of accessibility regarding color contrast.
Well, yeah, I was going to say it depends on, because the standards can vary. So
there are several standards, right? But the ones we are given by VMware, which I believe are the ones given by the US government for public domain applications, or not public domain, but applications used by public servants, those requirements are higher than what Material or Bootstrap respect, for instance, and we have to respect them. So, for instance, one very simple example, people have been asking for a yellow color in our color palette that lets you write on white on top of it. And Bootstrap offers one. We couldn't figure one out. As soon as it's contrasted enough with white, it pretty much looks brown. So there are some things like this that we don't have. We can't give you a warning button in yellow with white text because this is not going to be accessible according to the standards we have to respect.
Okay.
This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/adventures in Angular.
I thought that Material cared about that, and that the Lighthouse tooling is, you know about Lighthouse, right? Because it checks both responsiveness and all that other stuff, but it also has accessibility measures in it, and it picks up things like contrast, I thought. Did I miss something, or? Do you use other tools to validate your accessibility requirements?
So we initially tried several tools, and because we wanted that completely integrated with the build, we actually have code in our SaaS functions that take a bunch of arguments, the text color, the background color, but also the font weight, the font size, etc., and return pretty much a Boolean saying yes or no, this is accessible according to whatever the standards are. And I believe that code, we didn't write it, we took it from one of those tools and of course acknowledge it in the code. But this is what we're using. We care about it so much, it's in our SaaS itself. And to be fair, Material is way better than Bootstrap in terms of accessibility. They do have a lot of checking in there, and a lot of it is accessible. It's just apparently not good enough for people deciding about accessibility at VMware. So this is where we had to do our own, and this is where we have a bit more constraints than other design systems.
Fascinating. Hey, can I switch gears on you? Something. One of the things that I've, John and Papa and I have been struggling with, is how to package up some, a third-party library, so that it can be consumed in the Angular ecosystem. And clearly, you must have solved this problem. So, how did you tackle it?
I can talk a little bit about that. We are currently doing a beta alpha for our next version, and we actually are using a tool that basically follows the Angular package format so that we can provide the consumption to people in a variety of builds. So what that basically means is providing the bundle, the code in the bundle folder, the code in the ES5 and the ES6 folder, so that however you're consuming Clarity, there's a package for you to consume with the typical tools. That's where we're moving to right now. It was all sort of looking at best practices and tweaking the build to output the code in the right place. That's the short answer I have for you.
Is this a tool you guys wrote? Is it something anybody can find?
Yeah, we looked at doing it ourselves, and at the time when we were making this, we were also making a switch to Webpack. There's a fellow out there with a tool called NG Packager, no E, and NGPACKGR, I think it is, that does this. There were a couple issues we had, and he was pretty responsive in helping us work through them and fixing some issues on his end. So I'd highly recommend it if you're just looking to package it up and not have to worry about it. When I looked into the code, it was a very interesting project because the way he's doing it is basically instantiating the Angular compiler in code and then iterating through all the files that you give it when you configure his tool. So it was kind of novel from where I sat when I looked at how he was doing it.
But you decided to go a different way, it sounds.
No, we went with the NG Packager. We looked at that versus rolling our own to conform to the Angular package format, and decided to go with NG Packager because it did everything we needed and we didn't have to write it ourselves.
Right, because that's one I've been hearing most about. I don't have any direct experience with it, but yeah, NG Packager. Okay, we should put that in the show notes.
Yeah, NG Packager is really good. One thing also is that we started Clarity when Angular was still in beta. We released internally when Angular was in release candidates, and then open source later when Angular was fully released. And because of this, our build and delivery system has changed at least 5 times with a complete refactor every time. So these days we're using NG Packager, but before that, yes, we did have a manual gulp build. At some point, even in the beginning, we didn't even have gulp. It was just plain NPM and scripting. So a lot of solutions out there. The problem is nowadays to deliver an Angular application, you need so many deliverables, the types on one side and the ES6 JavaScript on the other, and then the modules in JavaScript 2, and then the main bundle. And you have a bunch of deliverables. And this is where, ng packager, not having to maintain it and having someone as responsive as he is working on it is great. And we're hoping if more people adopt it, then there can be external contributions to it, and it can pretty much be the standard to deliver third-party libraries with Angular.
Yeah, that's good. I'm pretty much stuck in my own stuff with my gulp tasks, which fortunately have no components in them, right? Because I tend to do these kind of invisible infrastructure typey things. So you guys, with having to play ball with the Angular compiler and have components, it's it's really got to work for you. So if it works for you, it should work for those of us writing less ambitious things.
Exactly. And it let us, in particular, we were able to still have a single code base and 3 different NPM packages to publish. That did work.
So what's your frontier? What's next?
We've heard of Clarity charts, Clarity, a lot of things. To be fair, right now there are a few things we really wanted to do to stabilize the code enough to call Clarity 1.0. We're still 0. something. We're stable enough that actual products use us everywhere, but we still had a few breaking changes in mind to clean up the code base. And these have been postponed by other higher priorities constantly, new features that absolutely need to happen now and things like that. Of course, we're open source, but we work for a large company. So sometimes what we want to do for the open source doesn't happen before what the company really needs right now. After the 1.0, though, we did have several projects in mind. Someone did really want to start Clarity charts. And for this, we have to investigate whether we want to use existing charting libraries, write it from scratch, whatever the solution is. If we want to go, from scratch or D3 or higher level things like, I believe it's C3 is like a layer on top of D3. There were also talks, and this is more internal, but about more specific components that don't make sense in a library, pretty much splitting Clarity into smaller pieces so that maybe we can have different teams working on different subsets of components, and then people will only pick and choose what they need. When I say this, I'm thinking of what was it? There were some very, very specific components requested at VMware, stuff like spreadsheets and what was the other one? Something about splitters, code editing or something like this. These are too specific to be part of a generic component library. So these would be potentially part of a different library that would ship on the side. But yeah, pretty much right now we're 100% focused on maintaining, stabilizing, releasing 1.0, and increasing the features of most of our components.
Yeah, I think one of the other ones was some sort of like a feedback tool or some sort of widget that could be included in an app that handles all of the feedback or chatting for your app. But I want to touch base too on something else we've talked about, which is we just put out the Clarity Dark theme because that was asked for by a lot of our internal customers, and tried to do it in a way that ended up doing something very similar or almost the same that Bootstrap did, in that you override SAS variables and then you can customize the output if you're doing your own custom build. But we also, when I did that work, I recognized that it was, just clunky enough and just hard enough that we want to explore two things. One is giving a little more control in a dynamic nature to the themes applied to specific components. And the other one is exposing some of the accessibility code, the mixins and the plugins that we use in the SaaS that Eudes talked about earlier for accessibility, exposing those in a way that's easy to use. And part of that would be sort of documenting how it's being used in our code base, so that others can take advantage of that with their own stuff if they're doing a custom build with Clarity anyways.
Oh, there's one more thing I forgot to mention. I don't know how it slipped. I mean, I know it's Adventures in Angular, but one of the things we're thinking of doing after this is obviously releasing Clarity for other JavaScript frameworks. We
never talk about those. We never.
I know you don't.
We don't acknowledge that they exist.
Let's just say custom elements, not other frameworks, just native custom elements.
Oh no, we never say the R word here. We never say.
Oh no, I'm not mentioning the R word, the V word, none of these.
No. You can talk about Backbone if you want, though.
To that anyway. You're safe. Yeah. So this is
so you are making plans for custom elements as well as other frameworks.
We actually had this. I'm going to say the R word, but we had a very, very strong request internally at VMware from one product to do Clarity React, and we considered options. We did quick prototypes for Clarity React, Clarity Stencil, I believe, with Stencil.js because it looked promising at the time, and Clarity Custom Elements, where we just manually do custom elements, or at the time there wasn't Angular elements. So we were looking at different options. If we really, really needed to support Clarity React, if we really, really needed to support React, based on those prototypes, if I remember correctly, we would do an actual Clarity React, but this is not part of the plans right now. Clarity custom elements is. We do want to do at some point Clarity custom elements. You remember how I said that Clarity has this, we call this Clarity UI, but this layer where you can just put the CSS and anything static is properly styled? Well, we would like to add plain JavaScript or custom elements to this so that we can grow it little by little by adding first the simple components that require just a little JavaScript and potentially one day reach feature parity, for instance, with Clarity Angular. But that would be fantastic because that would let people not using Angular still use the more dynamic components. But again, right now, all of VMware uses Angular, or 90% of VMware uses Angular, and we're focused on that because I do believe as a developer that right now, if you're writing large enterprise applications with dozens of developers on the same app, Angular is the only choice. I won't necessarily go into detail for this, but yeah, so we're focused on Angular right now.
Well, the sponsors of our show who send boatloads of money Chuck's way every week so that we can say Angular are very pleased to hear this. No, but I mean, joking aside, it is interesting. And Ionic, for example, which was on here a while back, was talking about how they were doing everything with custom elements underneath so that they could support all the frameworks. That was part of their new architecture, if I remember correctly. Probably butchered it.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting choice. And Angular Elements is an interesting choice.
We talked to them, actually. I believe we talked to someone at Ionic. And one of the issues I have looking at their solution, and it's actually the one I have from the beginning with custom elements, is as good as your custom element can be, sure, it will integrate with all frameworks or almost all frameworks out there. But it will always be less performant than a solution written natively in that framework. And this is my problem. If you're focusing on enterprise apps and you're, for instance, trying to write a data table that can handle 1 million items in there, sure, you can write a custom elements table that will work for all frameworks. But if it's 50% slower than the one written in Angular and the one written in the other frameworks, then no one's going to use it. Everyone using a framework will just use the one from their framework. So that's my main problem.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Data tables are like, I don't even know how that you could necessarily. You'd have to. I would think you'd have to sidestep a lot of things. You're going to virtualize. You got all. I mean, that one's really tough to make that perform.
But little details. Anything that handles drag and drop will kill performances in an Angular app if you just write it as a custom element, because of zone actually encapsulating the whole page and watching everything.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've had that problem, I remember, with a past version of a drag and drop somewhere at VMware, and they had huge issues where you would drag and the application will slow down to a crawl, and they couldn't figure it out. And the answer was, yeah, it's just Angular watches everything on the page now instead of just scopes.
Yeah, that's the poster child. Drag and drop is a good poster child for teaching yourself how to step outside of the Angular zone.
Exactly.
Yeah. So those of you listening out there, and you want to have a motivation to learn about zones and how to get out of them. Yeah,
but when you do a custom element, how do you step out? Do you actually have a hard dependency on Angular and on zone? You can't, right? You can't have a hard dependency on Angular if your whole point is writing custom elements. So you can get out of the zone, and if you just write a custom element, your Angular users cannot run the full custom element outside of the zone either, because they just write the element in HTML. So there might be a solution, but the integration is going to be a nightmare.
It's a good warning point for folks out there.
So I really like the idea of doing custom elements, but I'm not jumping on it right now because of those performance issues. Every single framework will have performance issues, different ones, with custom elements. And as much as you might integrate with everyone, if you're not the best in every single, if you're not the best for every framework, then no one's going to use it.
Interesting. So one last question that I have is, and this goes more to how you write Clarity than anything else. You said that you're really strict about pull requests and things like that. What is your process then for validating pull requests and or contributing to Clarity and verifying that it works?
We literally talked about this yesterday to try and we have a ticket to iron out the process. So we've decided on the process. It hasn't been documented yet, so you're the first ones.
Yay!
First step is we're going to write just like you have issues templates on GitHub, we're going to write a contribution template, not for the PR, but for something you post as an issue or as a comment on an issue that you have to fill out to say, I want to contribute doing this. Are you okay with it? Because we've had too many PRs where people contribute and the core idea itself won't go through. Designers said, no, this is bad UX. We won't have it at all. And then the person who wrote it, wrote 1,000 lines of code and it's just not going in and we don't even have to review the code because designers said no. So first step is going to be, I want to contribute and do this. And the template is going to have stuff like, what is it going to look like? What's the user interaction? If I click, if I press enter, the keyboard shortcuts. And as I mentioned before, the API of the feature or the component you want to write. With those three, you don't even have to mention architecture yet. With those three, we can say if yes or no, you can start coding for your PR. And we'll try to be as responsive as possible on this. At that point, you can submit the PR. We'll review it. There's a pretty good chance that there's going to be significant changes requested on the PR. Sometimes architecture changes, but what we try and do is really help you and point out exactly what needs to be changed. It's still very manual and you have to do it yourself, but we're trying to point out. And then when we're really interested in the PR and it gets abandoned because it's too much work to maintain it for the people who wrote it, we'll take it, preserve the first comment from the author to acknowledge that they wrote it, and then take it over from there and refactor it. We've done that a couple times. On the larger PRs, sadly, we don't have time for it, but it's still possible. But we're hoping that by having this contribution template in the first place, it'll be much easier, and the PRs will have less things to modify once they come in.
That doesn't sound to me different than any other framework I've been involved with. I mean, take Angular itself. They're not chewing into every giant PR. A lot of the PRs are little gotchas here, comment fixes, things like that. And if you don't submit them with tests and you don't follow the guidelines and the templates, you're not going to get anywhere with a PR. And that's the rest of us who consume the framework are grateful for that strength.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Right? We're not interested in having you accept every PR that comes along so that the thing bristles with features that make no sense in terms of the overall architecture. But those little PRs that find bugs and fix them, those, that are accompanied with tests, those are always welcome. And if you suddenly have some giant feature you want to talk about, maybe it's better to talk to the framework owners before, creating this whole half-baked thing, and saying, what are you doing with my PR that touches 600 files, So I just wanted to say that I don't, you don't sound to me like people who are putting up roadblocks that are more severe than anything else that I would expect.
You haven't seen the comments on the PRs. We've had, and I'm not joking about this, we've had PRs with 200 lines of code that had about 30 comments on them.
Wow.
A lot of this is also because, we hadn't documented our conventions and architecture and things that are. The only way for you to know is to look at our components, and because these have changed a few times because of all the Angular changes, obviously, since beta, some of the components you might look at might be outdated and might not have moved to the latest convention. So this is where we have a lot of issues with that. It's people taking a component as an example, copy-pasting it, starting from there, and then we come back and say, yes, we're sorry, that component hasn't been updated in the last year. And since then, Angular 4 and 5 have come out, and conventions have changed. We have to do it differently, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we're being pretty strict. Is we're trying really to follow specific conventions about how we do things. I had one at some point.
I think we respect that. I just wanted to say,
I know.
as somebody who's been out there, we respect that. Those people who have ever been in open source understand the dilemma and respect that decision.
And we're in Clarity, we were all new to open source, or pretty new to open source when we started. So something that might seem obvious to you took us, a few months to grasp sometimes. So we're still learning.
Yep. So I guess the one question that we didn't ask that we probably should have, and we're already over time, and I feel bad taking up a little bit of time, but if somebody wanted to try out Clarity, how do they pull it into their Angular app and start fiddling with it?
We actually have another Clarity Seed project. You can just Google Clarity Seed, and we maintain it enough that it stays up to date. It's a very simple Angular CLI app, and it's already got Clarity integrated. The other part is, if you don't want to do that, I would still recommend using the Angular CLI, and then we've got a step-by-step guide on the clarity.design website that walks you through, put this in your scripts array, put this in your styles array, and import from the correct package to get you up and running. So it's pretty easy to get started. A lot of that work is really because the Angular CLI is very usable.
Nice. We'll put a link to that in the show notes then, and that way curious parties can go check it out, and we don't have to try and explain over the. We don't have to try to read code over the podcast.
You sure make it sound easy, though.
Yeah.
It's not very hard. We need a step-by-step guide because there are 3 NPM packages: one for icons, one for the static styles, and one for the Angular components. But other than that, it's just installing simple NPM packages and Angular modules.
All right. Well, the last thing that I'm going to ask before we get to picks is if people want to follow what's going on with Clarity or follow you guys on Twitter, GitHub, or maybe have a blog, where do they go for that kind of thing?
Oh, sure. So we have a blog on Medium. It's Clarity Design System. And then our Twitter handle is at VMware Clarity. And we're pretty responsive on there. Another place that we needed some help, as someone mentioned earlier, with the deluge of issues and questions on GitHub. So we've started trying to redirect some of the things that are more questions and how-tos to Stack Overflow. So if you search on Stack Overflow for the VMware-Clarity tag, post a question there. We monitor those channels as well.
And all of these links are actually on our website, so you don't have to note them. We have a pretty cool URL. So the website is at clarity.design.
Oh,
That's
nice.
it. So at clarity.design, there's the website, and there is a community page. And on that page, you have the Twitter handle, the Stack Overflow tag, the Medium link, of course, the GitHub link, and you also have Twitter handles for every developer on the team and every designer on the team. So you can just go there. You'll have everything you need.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says "Pay me now." And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Alyssa, do you want to go first?
Well, sure. So these should not be new to you, unless, of course, you have been living under a rock. But NG Atlanta and NG Conf are both coming up. So if you'd like to go, I will assuredly be at both. Not sure in what capacity. I'm speaking at NG Atlanta. I hope to speak at NG Conf. But please get your tickets now while they're still available, because I would love to hang out with you all and talk nerdy. So yeah.
Awesome. Ward, do you have some picks for us?
Well, let's see. I got a new hammock for Christmas, and I slept out in Tahoe in sub-freezing weather in it, and I can report it's cold out there.
Wow, are you starting your career as a meteorologist?
Oh,
yeah, and
my goodness.
Yeah, the water bottle froze, but I'm still talking storm a lot.
Ward did.
So I can't recommend that experience just yet, but I got a present, which is a book called Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. And I read it in one sitting. Even though it's 260 pages, it goes really fast. And it's essentially a ghost story wrapped around a very intelligent ghost story wrapped around the death of Willie Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, and which was a crushing blow to the Lincolns. And Lincoln just can hardly let it go. He's really bereaved, and he goes out to the tomb where on the night that he's laid Willie to rest. And that's the historical fact. And around this is a wild ghost story in which characters in the graveyard are interacting with Willie and with Lincoln and with each other. And it's written in a style I've never seen before, and it's brilliant. And I'm not the only person who thinks so, because the really great writers have all talked about it and won the Man Booker Prize. So if you're interested in an unusual and gripping read, Lincoln in the Bardo is the book.
Awesome. Joe, what are your picks?
All right, so I just got one pick, and that is the movie Jumanji. Went and saw it with the family. Hilarious, well done movie. Was absolutely great. Highly recommend it. And that's it, Jumanji. And I think that at this point, since 100% of every movie, all the movies that I have seen with The Rock and oh my gosh, what's that comedian's name? The really short.
Oh, he's
guy.
wonderfully
Jack Black?
funny. Yes. No,
Not
he's
Jack Black.
Josh Gad?
well, he's in that. He's great. I know who you're thinking of. Sure.
Greek name?
What?
The one who's with the Greek name? No, that wasn't him. I don't remember.
Is it Josh Gad? Is he in that one? No?
No.
Kevin.
Yeah, it's the guy from Beauty.
Kevin Hart.
Kevin Hart.
Kevin Hart.
Any movie with Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart is awesome. Because the movie Central Intelligence was also absolutely
funny.
hilarious. Oh
That
my
was
gosh.
funny.
I'm surprised that you liked it, Joe, because me and you are pretty on par for movie taste.
Right?
And like, I was kind of bored.
With Jumanji or Central Intelligence?
Jumanji.
You were bored?
A little bit.
Did you like the original?
I did. I love the original. But this one felt like it was this awkward place between trying to be a kid movie, but like also trying to be an adult movie. And I feel like they missed both demographics. Like, not entirely. It was still entertaining, but I don't think it's collection worthy.
I thought that's
So,
what
like,
the first one was.
Did you see the one by the original with Robin Williams?
Like, who
that was a
hasn't,
terrific
man?
movie.
That one was awesome.
So you're saying you were just sort of bored and not bored at Star Wars bored?
Yeah.
Oh
You know,
my gosh, you hated Star Wars? Are you?
you missed it. I thought it was. It was
Okay,
awful,
can of worms
awful
open.
flower.
Let's.
Verging on 2 weeks. Awful.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna jump in
I
here.
never tire of giving my review of that movie.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in here with a couple of picks myself. So I'm starting to document the processes around making podcasts, and I have jumped from system to system to system trying to find a good place where I want to document this stuff, and I've had issues with pretty much all of them. But the latest one that I've settled on that is making me happier than the others is called PBWiki, and you can find it at pbworks.com. And I'm pretty happy with that. So if you're looking for a place to document stuff, that seems to be a good place. And the reason that I'm looking for something that's a little bit more sort of WYSIWYG editor-ish is because I have people who work on my stuff that don't want to write their the documentation that on the stuff they're doing in Markdown. So rather than make them learn Markdown, I just give them a simple WYSIWYG in a wiki. So anyway, that's my pick. Matt, what are your picks? Matt, are you on mute?
Yes, I was. Sorry. I put off learning Fluxbox as long as I possibly could, and that probably hurt me more in the long run. So this time around, I've been trying to get into a deeper dive of Grid, CSS Grid, and the avenue I'm using right now is a game called Grid Critters by the same guy who did Fluxbox Zombies last year. That's one of my picks. The other
friend of mine, good friend of mine, Dave Geddes, also an organizer of NGConf.
Cool. Yeah, it's a very well done app. I mean, it's very slick. I like how it works. The other thing I would recommend is I am not a huge history buff, but I wanted to learn more about Caesar and Rome, and I came across a podcast episode by Dan Carlin he runs a podcast called Hardcore History.
Oh,
and
that's awesome. I love that show. The Celtic Holocaust is one of the most fascinating 5.5 hours or so that I listen to history on, and so I would highly recommend that one.
I want the link to that. I've not heard of this.
Yeah, Hardcore History is incredible. Ood, what are your picks?
So, because my time these days on my job is spent mostly reviewing and in meetings and doing stuff like that more than coding, I actually like coding on my free time. And because most of my free time I have to spend with the kids watching Disney movies, especially Moana, I try and find little time to code here and there. So anything that gamifies code, I just love. So my first, both picks are going to go in that direction. My first pick, I'm almost sure someone recommended it beginning of December on the podcast, but it's Advent of Code. It's January 3rd, so it's over, but it's still available and anyone can do it. They have the 3 past years, and at the very least, if you don't want to do the past years, just monitor it for next December. So it's called Advent of Code, Advent just like as in Advent calendar. It's adventofcode.com, and it's 25 little puzzles that unlocked one after the other in December, and you would just go, you had to do some programming, some coding to solve the puzzles, and you'd get a nice picture at the end, little stars, things like that. It's just fun. And the other one that kind of blew my mind, and I really loved it, is a cyberpunk game I found randomly, and it's called Bitburner. Bitburner, yes, Bitburner. It's the first result on Google if you search this. And where it blew my mind is it's a game that you play by scripting the way you play the game. So first you do stuff manually, and then you script it, and then you script the scripts, and you do that over and over until it just, you're hoping it runs by itself, but they keep adding stuff over and over, so it can never run by itself. You're just adding more scripts. And what I liked about it is that it forces you to program in a absolutely terrible programming language. Think a terrible subset of JavaScript with. Is
it a real language, or is it something?
It's pretty much, no. The guy wrote his own interpreter for the code. He took JavaScript as a basis, so it's kind of a subset of JavaScript, but it has terrible variable scoping. It doesn't have objects. Functions are not objects. It's really, really, really basic language. And the reason he wrote his own interpreter is that it can actually run stuff offline, or it can interpret and generate statistics for that code. So, I mean, it makes sense. And the other part is, not only is the code terrible, is the language terrible, but it actually runs at 1 operation per 50 milliseconds. So you better make sure your code is fast, because otherwise you're going to be there forever. And that forces you to really think about what you're writing. And
this sounds like a nightmare to me.
and no, but it's an actual game, and so I can just tell you to try it. It works. You're hacking servers to gain money in the cyberpunk universe, and then you discover stuff after. I don't want to spoil, but it's very simple interface. It's just you're playing on a terminal. That's the whole interface.
It sounds like I've just been working on Joe's code.
So I mean,
gamification makes anything awesome, right? They could gamify like a root canal, and then people would want to go and have root canals.
Anything, but that one worked for me. Not all of them worked, but that one was. The constraints of the language actually make it pretty interesting to work with.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you both for coming. This has been a lot of fun, and really, it's just interesting to see what people are doing out there to contribute to Angular and to the community at large. And design is one of those areas that I don't feel like we necessarily talk about enough. So thank you for coming and sharing with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up, and we'll be back next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.